Margaret held her daughter Emma close as they sat in the sterile hospital waiting room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the little girl's pale face, and Margaret's heart ached with each labored breath her child took. At 42, Margaret had weathered many storms, but nothing had prepared her for this. The diagnosis had come like a thunderbolt 6 months ago, when Emma started having trouble breathing during their evening walks through the neighborhood. Margaret remembered how they used to stop at Mrs. Patterson's garden to smell the roses, and Emma would laugh as the petals tickled her nose. Now those simple joys seemed like memories from another lifetime. Margaret worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. She cleaned offices at night after her day shift at the local diner. Her hands were rough from years of hard work, but they were gentle when they brushed Emma's curls away from her fevered forehead. The medical bills had piled up, like autumn leaves, and Margaret felt herself drowning in debt. She had sold everything of value, including her grandmother's wedding ring and her father's old guitar. Still, it wasn't enough. Emma needed surgery that cost more money than Margaret could earn in 5 years. That morning, as Margaret carried Emma into the children's hospital, she noticed a well-dressed man in the hallway. He wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his shoes gleamed under the hospital lights. Richard Harrison had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a small construction company 40 years ago. He remembered the lean years when he and his late wife Sarah would count every penny and dream of better days. Those memories kept him humble, even as his wealth grew beyond what he had ever imagined at 65. Richard still went to the office every day, but lately he found himself thinking more about legacy than profit. His own children were grown with families of their own, living comfortable lives in distant cities. He and Sarah had never been blessed with grandchildren, and sometimes the big empty house felt like an echo chamber of missed opportunities. Richard was at the hospital for his monthly board meeting. The Harrison Foundation funded several wings of the children's hospital, and Richard liked to see firsthand how their donations were being used. As he walked through the corridors, he often stopped to chat with families and staff members, finding these conversations more meaningful than most of his business meetings. He noticed Margaret immediately. Something about her quiet desperation reminded him of his own mother, who had struggled to raise him alone after his father died in a factory accident. Margaret was whispering to Emma, trying to keep her calm as they waited to see the doctor. Richard couldn't help but overhear as Margaret spoke to the receptionist. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor underneath. She was asking about payment plans and charity programs, anything that might help her afford Emma's treatment. The receptionist was kind but firm. The surgery Emma needed was specialized and expensive. While the hospital had some assistance programs, the waiting list was long and the criteria strict. Margaret's income put her just above the threshold for most aid programs. Richard watched as Margaret's shoulders sagged with each piece of disappointing news. Emma looked up at her mother with those wide, trusting eyes that children have, and Margaret managed to smile even as tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Margaret whispered. "Mama will figure something out. She always does." But Richard could see that Margaret was running out of options. Her clothes were clean but worn, and he noticed how she carefully rationed the small bag of crackers she shared with Emma. Everything about her spoke of someone who had given everything for their child. Richard remembered his own mother's sacrifices. She had worked as a seamstress, taking in extra work at night to keep their small family afloat. She never complained, but he had seen her counting and recounting the few bills in her purse, trying to make them stretch until payday. As Margaret and Emma waited for their appointment, Richard found himself unable to concentrate on his board meeting. His mind kept wandering to the mother and daughter in the waiting room. He thought about Sarah and how much she would have loved to help. He could almost hear her voice telling him what he needed to do. After the meeting, Richard approached Dr. Williams, the head of pediatric surgery. He had known James Williams for 15 years, ever since the hospital had first approached him about funding their children's wing. "James," Richard said quietly, "there's a little girl here today, Emma. I think her name is. Her mother is Margaret. They need help." Dr. Williams nodded knowingly. I've reviewed Emma's case. The surgery she needs is complex but very doable. The problem is financial, as you might guess. The family has no insurance coverage for this type of procedure. Richard was quiet for a moment, watching through the window as Margaret held Emma close. The little girl had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, and Margaret was humming softly an old lullaby that Richard remembered his own mother singing. What would it cost? Richard asked. The surgery and all the follow-up care, Dr. Williams mentioned, a figure that would have been overwhelming for Margaret, but was barely a fraction of what Richard spent on charitable donations each year. Take care of it, Richard said simply, but I don't want them to know where the money came from. Tell them. An anonymous donor covered everything. Dr. Williams smiled. He had seen Richard's quiet generosity many times over the years. You know, this is exactly what Sarah would have wanted you to do. Richard nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been missing for too long. She always said that money was just paper unless you used it to write a better story for someone. The next morning, Margaret received a call that changed everything. The hospital financial counselor asked her to come in for a meeting about Emma's care. Margaret's heart pounded as she made her way to the office, expecting more bad news about payment schedules and debt collection. Instead, she was told that an anonymous benefactor had covered all of Emma's medical expenses, not just the surgery, but all the follow-up appointments, physical therapy, and medications she would need. Margaret stared at the financial counselor in disbelief. I don't understand, she said. Someone paid for everything, but why? Who would do such a thing? Sometimes, the counselor said gently. Angels come in unexpected forms. All I can tell you is that someone wanted to make sure Emma gets the best possible care. Margaret broke down, crying, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. For months she had carried the weight of impossible choices on her shoulders. Now suddenly that burden was lifted by a stranger's kindness. Emma's surgery was scheduled for the following week. Dr. Williams assured Margaret that the procedure had a very high success rate and that Emma should make a complete recovery. With proper care, she would be able to live a normal, healthy life. The night before the surgery, Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked to Emma's bedside and watched her daughter, sleeping peacefully, finally breathing without the struggle that had become so familiar. Margaret whispered a prayer of thanksgiving for the mysterious donor who had given them this second chance. Richard also found it hard to sleep that night. He kept thinking about the little girl and wondering if his decision had been right. Sarah had always teased him about his tendency to overthink his charitable giving. The heart knows before the head does. She used to say, trust it, on the morning of Emma's surgery. Richard found himself at the hospital earlier than usual. He told himself he was there for routine foundation business, but he knew the real reason. He needed to know that Emma was okay. He waited in a different part of the hospital, staying far from the surgical wing. He didn't want to intrude on Margaret's privacy, but he couldn't bring himself to leave either. Hours seemed to crawl by as he imagined what the family must be going through. Finally, Dr. Williams found him in the hospital cafeteria. The surgery was a complete success, he reported with a tired but happy smile. Emma is a tough little girl. She came through beautifully and should make a full recovery. Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had suddenly lifted, and the mother, he asked Margaret, is over the moon. Dr. Williams said, I've never seen someone so grateful. She keeps asking how she can thank the donor. She wants to write a letter. At least, Richard shook his head. No letters, no thanks needed. This was meant to be anonymous, and I want it to stay that way. Over the following weeks, Richard found excuses to visit the hospital more often than usual. He would catch glimpses of Margaret and Emma during their follow-up appointments, always from a distance, never intruding, but somehow needing to see that they were doing well. Emma was indeed recovering beautifully. Her color returned, and her energy came back in bursts that delighted. Her mother, Margaret, had found a part-time job at the hospital itself in the billing department. The staff had been so impressed with her dedication and intelligence that they offered her training for a full-time position with benefits. Richard learned about Margaret's new job through Dr. Williams and felt a quiet satisfaction. The decision to help this family kept revealing new layers of rightness. Emma would have her health back, and Margaret would have security and purpose. One afternoon, about 2 months after the surgery, Richard was walking through the hospital when he heard familiar laughter. He looked around and saw Emma playing in the children's recreation area. She was building something.